The holidays, they're supposed to be about warmth and connection, but for some, they can be a painful reminder of loneliness. Sadly, sometimes that vulnerability can make people targets of just unimaginable acts. And that brings us to the deeply disturbing case of Kevin Bacon.
Yeah, it's a case that shook many, and it's so important to delve into it carefully to really understand the complexities.
Kevin was a 25-year-old hairdresser from Michigan. He disappeared on Christmas Eve 2019 after connecting with a man named Mark Latinsky on Grindr. His last text to his roommate was around 6 p.m., saying he wasn't sure when he'd be home. Sadly, that meeting would be his last.
Right. Police found Kevin's car abandoned, and the trail led them to Latinsky's house. What they found inside was truly horrifying. But before we get into that, let's try to understand who Mark Latinsky is.
Okay, so paint a picture of Latinsky for us. What do we know about him?
On the surface, Latinsky seemed like a successful man. He was a chemist, had a six-figure salary, was married with 4 children, appeared to be living a normal life. It's hard to reconcile that image with the heinous crimes he committed.
It's almost like two different people. His ex-wife even mentioned that he would watch, and I quote, torture movies when he was off his medication. That's a pretty disturbing detail and makes you wonder about his mental state.
Absolutely. And this is where Latinsky's mental health history becomes crucial to understanding this case. He had a complex combination of diagnoses, major depression with psychotic features, paranoid schizophrenia, and borderline personality traits.
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack. What does that combination of diagnoses actually tell us? It sounds incredibly complex.
It is. It's actually rare to see such a mixture of conditions. For the psychiatrists who were trying to understand and treat him, it presented a very unique and challenging case. Each of these diagnoses comes with its own set of symptoms and challenges, and when combined, they can create a very volatile and unpredictable situation.
So even the experts were struggling to get a handle on his mental state. Looking back, were there any signs, any red flags that hinted at the darkness to come?
That's the unsettling part. There were 2 incidents prior to Kevin Bacon's murder that, in hindsight, could be seen as major warning signs.
Really? Tell me more about these incidents.
In October 2019, just 2 months before Kevin's death, a man named James Carlson called 911. He had managed to escape from Latinsky's basement after being chained up.
Ah,
Carlson had also traveled to meet Latinsky for sex, which is a disturbingly similar pattern to Kevin's case.
that's chilling. It sounds like there was already a pattern of predatory behavior. Was there anything else?
Yes. In November 2019, one of Latinsky's neighbors found a bloodied man on his porch. The man claimed Latinsky wanted to hurt him. The police were called, but no arrests were made at the time.
That's so frustrating. It seems like there were missed opportunities to intervene before the tragedy with Kevin Bacon.
It does raise questions about whether anything could have been done differently. But let's go back to December 27th. The police finally enter Latinsky's house. What do they find?
This is where it gets really difficult to hear, but I think it's important for us to understand the full extent of this horrific crime. What was the scene like?
It was a scene of unimaginable horror. Kevin Bacon's body was found mutilated and hanging upside down from the ceiling.
It's hard to even fathom the level of depravity involved in something like that. It sounds like something out of a nightmare.
And if that wasn't horrific enough, Latinsky confessed to stabbing Kevin, castrating him, and then cannibalizing his remains.
Oh my God. This is beyond comprehension. It's hard to wrap my head around how anyone could commit such atrocities.
It's truly the darkest side of humanity. Latinsky's defense attorney, Doug Corwin, later shared that Latinsky had delusions of grandeur, believing he was of royal lineage.
So he was completely detached from reality. Did he ever express any remorse for what he did?
According to Corwin, Latinsky never showed any remorse for his actions, which is a chilling indication of his mental state.
This is all so disturbing. It's hard to believe that someone could be so devoid of empathy. But what about the legal ramifications? What happened after his arrest?
Latinsky was charged with open murder and mutilation of a body. Initially, he pleaded insanity, hoping to be confined to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment rather than prison.
That makes sense given his mental state. Did the insanity plea work?
Well, after being found competent to stand trial, he eventually changed his plea to guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So justice was served in the end. But it doesn't erase the horrific nature of his crimes. This case raises so many questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and the role of law enforcement in preventing such tragedies.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
You're right. There's still a lot to unpack, especially when it comes to the psychology behind cannibalism and the impact this case had on everyone involved, including Latinsky's attorney. It's easy to get caught up in the gruesome details of a case like this. But to really understand what happened, we need to explore the psychological aspects. And one of the most disturbing aspects is, of course, the cannibalism.
Yeah, it's a subject that both horrifies and fascinates me. I have to admit, I'm really curious to hear your insights on this. What can you tell us about the psychology behind cannibalism?
Well, it's a rare phenomenon, but what's interesting is the difference in approach between cannibalistic killers and other types of murderers. What do you mean by approach? Are you saying there's a specific way cannibalistic killers commit their crimes?
Yes, there are often distinct patterns. You see, individuals with certain severe mental illnesses, like major depression or psychotic disorders, might exhibit what we call an aggressive style of killing.
Okay, so what does that mean in practical terms?
Their attacks can be very frenzied, uncontrolled, with excessive violence. There's a lot of rage involved. It's almost like an overkill situation.
That makes sense. But you're saying cannibalistic killers are different.
Often, yes. In many cases of cannibalism, the acts are more methodical and calculated. It's not a sudden explosion of rage, but rather a deliberate, almost ritualistic process.
Wow, that's even more disturbing in a way. It suggests a level of premeditation that's truly chilling.
Exactly. And that methodical nature suggests that the motivations behind cannibalism might be much more complex. It could be psychologically or even psychosexually driven rather than simply fueled by aggression.
So in Latunsky's case, given his history of mental illness and delusions,
Hmm.
could his cannibalism be seen as part of a larger psychological pattern?
It's impossible to say for sure without a thorough psychological evaluation, but it's a question worth considering. You have the mental illness, you have the delusions of grandeur, and then you have this very methodical approach to the crime. It's possible that the cannibalism was a manifestation of a deeper psychological disturbance.
It's also disturbing. I think what makes this case even more unsettling is that it feels like something that could happen anywhere to anyone.
It's a stark reminder that even in the 21st century, the darkest impulses of human nature can still emerge. And it's not just the victim and their family who are affected by these horrific crimes. This case had a profound impact on many, including those involved in the legal system. Take Latunsky's attorney, Doug Corwin, for example.
You're right. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for him to defend someone who committed such heinous acts. Did Corwin ever speak about his experience?
He did. He said this case was unlike anything he'd ever encountered before. It forced him to confront the darkest parts of humanity and grapple with the complexities of the legal system.
So this case wasn't just a horrific tragedy for Kevin and his family, but it also had a ripple effect impacting those involved in the legal proceedings. It's almost like a dark cloud hanging over everyone involved.
Absolutely. It's a sobering thought. These cases don't just end with a verdict. They leave lasting scars on everyone involved.
As we continue to delve into this case, I think it's important to remember that Kevin Bacon was a real person full of life who was tragically taken too soon. His encounter with Mark Latunsky exposed the darkest depths of human depravity.
You're right. And while Latunsky was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, that doesn't erase the pain and suffering he caused.
This case has left a deep wound on the community, and I think it serves as a chilling reminder of how vulnerable we all are, especially when seeking connection. It also highlights the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and the need for better systems of support and intervention.
Absolutely. It raises so many questions about whether this tragedy could have been prevented. Were there missed opportunities? Could things have been done differently?
That's what's so haunting about this case. It's hard not to wonder if there were any warning signs that were missed, or if there were things that could have been done to change the course of events.
It's a question that deserves careful consideration. But one thing is for sure, we have to learn from this case. We have a responsibility as a society to protect vulnerable individuals, address mental health needs, and create a system that prevents violence.
I completely agree. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to those red flags we talked about earlier. It seems like there were some missed opportunities to potentially intervene.
You're right. Both the incident with James Carlson being chained in the basement and the bloodied man on the neighbor's porch were clear warning signs that something wasn't right. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were a pattern of behavior that escalated to a horrific tragedy.
It makes you wonder, if those incidents had been taken more seriously, could Kevin still be alive today?
It's a question that's impossible to answer definitively, but it does highlight the need for better communication and coordination between law enforcement, mental health professionals, and the community. It's about recognizing those red flags and taking appropriate action before it's too late.
It's a heartbreaking thought, and it really underscores the complexity of this case. There's the criminal justice element, the mental health aspect, and then the question of individual and societal responsibility. It's a lot to process.
It is. And we can't forget the human cost of this tragedy. Kevin Bacon's family and friends are left with an unimaginable void in their lives.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the details of a case like this, but we can't lose sight of the fact that a young life was tragically cut short.
And the impact extends far beyond Kevin's immediate circle. This case shook the entire LGBTQ plus community, raising concerns about safety and vulnerability.
You're right. This tragedy highlighted the very real dangers that exist for individuals within the LGBTQ plus community. Sadly, they can be targeted because of their sexual orientation or gender identity.
It's a reminder that we still have a long way to go in creating a society where everyone feels safe and accepted regardless of who they are or who they love.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but also deeply unsettling. It's a stark reminder of the darkness that exists in the world, and how important it is to be aware, to look out for each other, and to advocate for better systems of support and protection.
I agree. While we can't undo what happened, we can learn from these tragic events and work towards a future where such horrors are prevented.
As we wrap up our deep dive into this case, I think it's important to reiterate that we all have a role to play in creating a safer and more just world. Whether it's advocating for better mental health resources, supporting vulnerable communities, or simply being more aware of the warning signs of potential violence, we can all make a difference.
Well said. It's about recognizing the complexities, asking tough questions, and working together to find solutions.
Thank you for joining us on this difficult but crucial journey.